The Fairview County Courthouse was alive with its usual morning buzz. The grand marble halls echoed with the hurried footsteps of attorneys, clerks, and defendants making their way through the building. The scent of wood polish lingered in the air, mixing with the tension that always seemed to accompany a day in court. Inside courtroom 3B, an audience had gathered, some as spectators, others awaiting their own cases. Among them was a woman, quietly stepping through the heavy oak doors. She wasn't dressed in an expensive designer suit like the attorneys who dominated the space. She didn't carry herself with the air of someone who belonged. Instead, she was clad in a simple navy blue suit, slightly worn from time, and carried an old leather briefcase that had clearly seen better days. To Judge William Prescott, the middle-aged black woman standing before him was nothing more than another defendant, unimportant, out of her depth, and easy to dismiss. His cold blue eyes flickered with disapproval as he glanced over her appearance. The smirk tugging at his lips made it clear. He had already made up his mind about her. Vanessa Carter was just another lost soul trying to represent herself against a well-seasoned attorney. From the judge's bench, Prescott leaned back in his chair, hands folding over one another in a practiced display of authority. His reputation was legendary in Fairview County, sharp-tongued, intimidating, and known for his brutal condescension toward those he deemed unworthy of his time. Few ever dared to challenge him, and fewer still walked away victorious. When the bailiff called the next case, Vanessa lifted her chin and stepped forward, her expression calm yet unreadable. Every step she took was careful, deliberate, as if she were measuring the ground beneath her. As she reached the defense table, she placed her worn briefcase down with precision. Next case, Judge Prescott announced, barely hiding his boredom. Gregory Stanton versus Vanessa Carter. He adjusted his glasses and narrowed his eyes at Vanessa. Miss Carter, he began, dragging out her name with exaggerated formality. You're representing yourself today, I see. Yes, Your Honor, Vanessa replied, her voice steady and respectful. Prescott exhaled heavily, shaking his head as if this were just another inconvenience in his already long day. Well, this should be interesting, he muttered, loud enough for the courtroom to hear. A soft wave of chuckles rippled through the gallery. Attorneys exchanged amused glances. A few spectators smirked. It was clear that nobody expected much from Vanessa Carter. But what they didn't know, what no one realized, was that she wasn't just another defendant. Behind Vanessa's quiet demeanor was a brilliant legal mind, one that had been carefully calculating every step leading to this moment. She had a plan, and when the time came to reveal the truth, it would leave the courtroom in shock, and Judge Prescott reeling from his own arrogance. She had spent years preparing for this fight. The truth was on her side, and before this case was over, she intended to turn the entire courtroom upside down. The courtroom had settled into an uneasy silence, save for the rhythmic tapping of Judge William Prescott's pen against his desk. Across from him, Thomas Whitaker, the plaintiff's attorney, exuded a confidence so thick it nearly suffocated the air. He was a man accustomed to winning, particularly against defendants who represented themselves, especially ones like Vanessa Carter. With a smug smirk, Whitaker adjusted his gleaming gray suit, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the pristine fabric. His posture was relaxed, but the gleam in his eyes carried the sharp edge of a man convinced he had already won. He turned to the judge and began his presentation. Your Honor, this case is straightforward, Whitaker announced, his voice smooth and well-rehearsed. My client, Gregory Stanton, has maintained legal possession of the disputed property for the past 5 years. The defendant, Miss Carter, has no legitimate claim to it. Any argument to the contrary is simply an attempt to delay the inevitable. Vanessa sat motionless, her hands resting lightly on the surface of the defense table. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of careful neutrality. But beneath it, her mind was working rapidly, breaking apart Whitaker's carefully constructed argument piece by piece. As he spoke, she methodically jotted notes in a small, leather-bound notebook, her pen gliding smoothly across the paper. Her handwriting was sharp and precise, a contrast to the mess of deception she was about to expose. Every now and then, her gaze flicked upward to meet Judge Prescott's steely eyes, holding his gaze for just a moment before returning to her notes. It wasn't defiance. It was quiet determination. When Whitaker finished his statement, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest with a triumphant air. The courtroom was his stage, and he expected Vanessa to be nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But when Vanessa rose from her seat, there was a subtle shift in the room. She gathered her papers, adjusted the cuffs of her simple navy blue blazer, and stepped forward with the kind of calm control that demands attention. "Your Honor," she began, her voice measured and firm, "opposing counsel's argument rests on several misrepresentations of fact, which I will address in due course." Her words did not waver, and the weight of them caused the gallery to still, a hush falling over the spectators. Judge Prescott, however, was unimpressed. He held up a hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. "Miss Carter," he drawled, his voice heavy with condescension, "I trust you're aware that this isn't a classroom lecture. Keep it concise." Vanessa paused, her expression unchanging. "Of course, Your Honor," she said smoothly. "I was simply laying the foundation for my argument." Judge Prescott gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Proceed, but let's not get lost in the weeds, shall we?" A few chuckles echoed through the courtroom, but Vanessa ignored them. She had faced moments like this before, where her capabilities were dismissed before she had even spoken, where prejudice hid beneath the thin veil of professionalism. But today, she would not be deterred. She turned back to the judge, her voice steady as she continued. "Your Honor," Vanessa stated, holding up a legal document for the court to see, "opposing counsel has presented Exhibit B as conclusive proof of ownership. However, upon closer examination, there are discrepancies in the signature dates that suggest—" "Objection!" Whitaker snapped, rising to his feet, his voice laced with irritation. "Your Honor, the defendant is speculating." Vanessa didn't even flinch. "I am merely pointing out inconsistencies in the evidence presented," she countered smoothly. She turned to Judge Prescott, her eyes sharp. "Your Honor, I would like to request that Exhibit B be examined for authenticity." The judge sighed audibly, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. "Miss Carter," he said, his patience thinning, "this is not the time to play detective. Stick to the facts." Vanessa did not blink. "With respect, Your Honor," she replied, "authenticity is a fact, and it is relevant to this case." For the first time, there was a brief pause in the courtroom. The tension in the air became almost tangible as Judge Prescott's jaw tightened. His narrowed eyes flickered across the document Vanessa held. He was not accustomed to being challenged so directly. Finally, after a long moment, he exhaled sharply. "Fine," he said, his tone clipped, "but make it quick." The ruling was made, but Vanessa had already sensed the shift. The judge wasn't as untouchable as he pretended to be, and Whitaker knew it. The plaintiff's attorney's confidence had been slightly dented, but he refused to let it show. Vanessa pressed forward, her voice patient yet surgical, as she meticulously dissected the plaintiff's claims. "As I was saying," she continued, "the dates on Exhibit B do not align with the plaintiff's prior financial records, nor do they match the timestamps on Exhibit D, which documents the alleged sale. If the court examines these inconsistencies, it will see that—" "Your Honor," Whitaker interrupted again, his voice edged with growing frustration. "The defendant is attempting to muddy the waters." Vanessa turned to face him fully, her eyes unwavering. "Or perhaps, Your Honor," she said coolly, "the plaintiff is grasping at stolen property." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Prescott slammed his gavel against the bench, his voice sharp as he barked, "Order." His gaze shifted to Vanessa, and for the first time, there was something new in his expression. Not just irritation, but curiosity. She had his attention now. Whitaker, however, was losing his composure. He glanced over at Gregory Stanton, the plaintiff, whose face had begun to pale. Vanessa took note of every flicker of unease. She wasn't just challenging their case, she was exposing it for what it really was. And this was only the beginning. The tension in Fairview County Courthouse was nearly palpable, thickening with each passing moment as Vanessa Carter continued to dismantle the plaintiff's case. For the first time that morning, Thomas Whitaker, the once confident attorney, began to stumble over his responses. His words, which had once been polished and rehearsed, now carried the edge of someone struggling to maintain control. Even Judge William Prescott, who had spent much of the trial undermining Vanessa at every opportunity, was finding it increasingly difficult to keep up his dismissive attitude. Still, he clung to his condescension, masking his growing unease behind the same smirking arrogance he had displayed since the start of the trial. During a brief recess, as the courtroom emptied for a short break, Judge Prescott glanced over at Vanessa with something that resembled curiosity. "Miss Carter," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you're remarkably thorough for someone untrained in the law." Vanessa met his gaze evenly. "I've spent considerable time studying it, Your Honor." Prescott scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Well, studying isn't the same as practicing," he quipped. "But I suppose you'll learn that soon enough." Vanessa didn't rise to the bait. She simply offered the faintest hint of a smile before turning back to her neatly organized files. Let him think what he wanted. The truth was about to speak for itself. When court resumed, the hushed murmurs of the gallery faded, giving way to the commanding bang of Judge Prescott's gavel. Vanessa flipped through her papers with steady hands, selecting the documents she needed with absolute precision. Across the room, Thomas Whitaker smirked, glancing at her as though she were nothing more than an annoying inconvenience. To him, she was just another defendant, a mere footnote in his long line of easy victories. But that was about to change. "All right," Judge Prescott cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "Let's get back to it. Mr. Whitaker, you may proceed with your witness." Whitaker stood, his arrogance returning as he straightened his suit and adjusted his cufflinks. "The plaintiff calls Martin Hollis to the stand," he announced. A frail-looking man in his late 60s stepped forward, adjusting his ill-fitting gray suit as he nervously took his seat. Martin Hollis had managed the disputed property for the past 10 years and was expected to solidify Gregory Stanton's ownership claim. Whitaker paced the courtroom, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Mr. Hollis, can you confirm that you have been the property manager for the real estate in question for the past decade?" "Yes," Hollis replied, his voice shaky but audible. "And during that time," Whitaker continued, "have you ever seen the defendant, Vanessa Carter, make any claims to ownership of this property?" Hollis hesitated for the briefest moment, his eyes flickering toward Vanessa before shaking his head. "No, I haven't." Whitaker grinned triumphantly, turning toward Judge Prescott. "No further questions, Your Honor." He strode back to his seat, casting a self-satisfied glance in Vanessa's direction. But Vanessa wasn't rattled. Not in the slightest. She slowly rose from her chair, gathering her papers with a deliberate grace that made the courtroom hold its breath. "Miss Carter," Judge Prescott raised an eyebrow, "your witness, should you choose to cross-examine." Vanessa took a single step forward, her heels clicking softly against the tile as she approached Martin Hollis. She was in no hurry. She wanted the weight of her presence to settle before she even spoke. "Mr. Hollis," she began, her tone polite but firm, "you stated that you have managed the property in question for 10 years. Is that correct?" "Yes," Hollis answered, shifting slightly in his seat. "And during that time," she continued, "would you say that you had full access to the property's legal and financial records?" Another hesitation. His gaze flicked toward Whitaker, who gave the slightest nod. "Yes, I would," Hollis said, though his voice was noticeably less confident than before. Vanessa's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then you must be familiar with this document." She reached into her worn leather briefcase and withdrew a folded sheet of paper, holding it up for the courtroom to see. "This is the original deed of sale for the property, dated 15 years ago." She extended it toward Hollis. "Do you recognize the signature at the bottom?" Hollis squinted at the document, his nervousness growing. It looks like the plaintiff's signature," he admitted. Vanessa took a step closer, her voice soft but insistent. "And are you aware," she asked, "that this signature does not match the plaintiff's signature on subsequent documents, including Exhibit B, which your attorney introduced earlier?" A hush fell over the courtroom. Hollis shifted uncomfortably, his face visibly paling. I hadn't noticed," he stammered. Vanessa turned to Judge Prescott, her tone unwavering. "Your Honor, I would like to submit this document as evidence of forgery." For the first time, Judge Prescott leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he examined the document. His jaw tightened, and for a moment the courtroom was silent, save for the rustle of papers. "Miss Carter," Prescott finally said, his tone clipped, "this is quite the accusation. Do you have expert testimony to support this claim?" Vanessa nodded calmly. "I do, Your Honor," she stated, her confidence unwavering. "I've consulted a handwriting expert who has verified that the signatures on the documents are not consistent. Their full report is included in the appendix of my filings." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line as he glanced at Thomas Whitaker. Whitaker's confidence was beginning to crack. "Mr. Whitaker," Judge Prescott asked, Do you have a response to this? Whitaker stood abruptly, his expression a mix of annoyance and alarm. Your Honor, he said loudly, this is clearly a delay tactic. The defendant is grasping at straws. Vanessa turned toward him, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Or perhaps, Your Honor, she said smoothly, the plaintiff is grasping at stolen property. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Prescott slammed his gavel, calling for order. But as his gaze landed back on Vanessa, there was something new in his expression. Not just irritation, respect, curiosity, a flicker of doubt. Miss Carter, he said, his tone firm, you're walking a fine line. I'll allow this evidence, but tread carefully. This is still a court of law, not a stage for theatrics. Vanessa inclined her head. Understood, Your Honor. But deep down, she knew. She had just changed the course of the trial. By the time Fairview County Courthouse adjourned for the day, a buzz of murmurs filled the room. Spectators whispered to one another, astonished at the unexpected turn of events. Even Thomas Whitaker, usually composed and smug, avoided Vanessa Carter's gaze as he hastily gathered his papers. His once unshakable confidence now visibly rattled. Vanessa, in contrast, took her time. She slowly packed her briefcase, her movements deliberate and unhurried despite the intensity of the day's proceedings. She felt the weight of every stare, every hushed conversation as she exited the courtroom. But she didn't look back. This was far from over. Tomorrow she intended to turn the tide even further. The next morning, the Fairview County Courthouse was alive with anticipation. News of yesterday's revelations in courtroom 3B had spread, drawing curious onlookers and even a handful of reporters eager to witness what had now become a gripping legal battle. Vanessa Carter arrived early, her modest attire and calm demeanor standing in stark contrast to the charged energy swirling around her. She stepped into the courtroom, her worn leather briefcase still clutched firmly in hand. Across the room, Thomas Whitaker was already at his table. His normal smirk was gone, replaced by a furrowed brow as he whispered furiously to his assistant. He was clearly strategizing, but Vanessa gave no reaction. She walked to her seat, placed her briefcase down with calculated precision, and began reviewing her notes with unwavering focus. A few moments later, Judge William Prescott entered the courtroom. His black robes flowed behind him, his presence commanding as always. But something was different today. His expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his movements, a subtle shift that hadn't been there before. He struck his gavel once, and the courtroom fell silent. Let's proceed, he said curtly. His voice carried less of the overt condescension that had colored it the day before. It was subtle, but Vanessa noticed. Perhaps he was beginning to realize that this case wasn't as straightforward as he had assumed. The morning's proceedings resumed with the continuation of Vanessa's cross-examination of the plaintiff's witnesses. She rose from her seat, her movements deliberate and controlled, and approached the stand where Martin Hollis, the property manager, had been called back for additional testimony. Mr. Hollis, Vanessa began, her tone measured. Yesterday, you testified that you had never seen me make any claims to the property in question. Is that correct? Yes, Hollis replied cautiously. And yet, she continued, you admitted that you were unaware of the discrepancies in the property's title documents. Is that also correct? Hollis hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. Yes, I suppose that's true. Vanessa walked slowly to the evidence table, picking up a folder. Mr. Hollis, she said, turning back to him, as the property manager, are you responsible for maintaining accurate records for this property? Yes, he said, his voice quieter now. Then, Vanessa pressed on, lifting a series of documents for the courtroom to see. Can you explain why the tax receipts for this property, dating back 5 years, are in my name? A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Hollis's face turned pale as he glanced nervously at Whitaker, who was now furiously scribbling notes. Vanessa's voice remained calm but unyielding. Hollis, she continued, would you agree that paying property taxes is an indication of ownership? I guess so, he stammered. Vanessa turned to Judge Prescott, her expression composed. Your Honor, I move to strike Mr. Hollis's testimony as unreliable and request that the court consider these tax receipts as evidence of my ownership. Judge Prescott leaned back in his chair, his lips pressing into a thin line. He adjusted his glasses, glancing down at the documents before him. After a long pause, he sighed heavily. The motion is granted, he said reluctantly. The tax receipts will be admitted as evidence. Whitaker rose from his seat, his face a mask of barely contained frustration. Your Honor, he began, his voice tinged with irritation. The defendant's evidence, while compelling on the surface, does not address the core issue of the property deed's authenticity. Without expert testimony, her claims are purely speculative. Vanessa turned to face him, her expression calm but firm. Mr. Whitaker, she said, I believe the handwriting analysis I submitted yesterday speaks directly to the deed's authenticity. Perhaps you'd like to explain why the plaintiff's signature appears to change between documents. The courtroom fell silent. Whitaker's jaw tightened, and a bead of sweat formed on his temple. Your Honor, he said, his voice louder now, the defendant is attempting to distract from the facts of the case. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to shift the burden of proof. Vanessa didn't flinch. Desperation, she repeated, her voice cool and cutting. She turned toward Judge Prescott. Or perhaps, Your Honor, the plaintiff is grasping at stolen property. A sharp intake of breath swept through the room. Judge Prescott slammed his gavel. Order, he barked, his voice cutting through the noise. He turned his sharp gaze toward Vanessa. Miss Carter, he said, his tone firm, you will refrain from making accusations without concrete evidence. Vanessa nodded smoothly. Understood, Your Honor, she said, but I will let the evidence speak for itself. As the proceedings continued, Vanessa's calm, methodical approach began to unsettle not just Whitaker, but also Judge Prescott. Though he still interrupted her occasionally, his tone was different. The sharp edge he had wielded against her the day before was softening, and Vanessa saw it. Whitaker, on the other hand, was losing his grip. Vanessa introduced more damning evidence, emails between the plaintiff and a third party, discussing the potential resale of the property, financial records showing unexplained deposits into the plaintiff's account, shortly after the alleged purchase, even a sworn affidavit from a neighbor, confirming that Vanessa had been maintaining the property for years. With each piece of evidence, the cracks in the plaintiff's case deepened. Whitaker's composure frayed, Judge Prescott's demeanor shifted, and Vanessa Carter, the woman they had all underestimated, was winning control of the courtroom. This case was unraveling fast, and tomorrow she intended to finish it. The third day of the trial began with an unshakable stillness in Fairview County Courthouse. It was as though the very air in courtroom 3B braced for the storm that Vanessa Carter was about to unleash. The gallery was packed. Word had spread far beyond the courthouse walls, drawing in curious onlookers, legal professionals, and even a handful of reporters, eager to witness what was now being referred to as a David versus Goliath battle. Vanessa arrived early, as she always did, but today there was a quiet intensity in her eyes that hadn't been there before. This wasn't just about defending herself anymore. Today was about dismantling the entire case. She moved to the defense table, setting her worn leather briefcase on the polished wood surface with careful precision. Across the room, Thomas Whitaker shuffled his papers, his movements brisk and tense. His usual arrogance had faded, replaced by a grim determination. Even his suit was darker, as though he was trying to project a sense of control. But the unease in his expression betrayed him. A moment later, Judge William Prescott entered, his gavel striking sharply against the bench. Let's proceed, he said, his voice clipped. His usual smug confidence had dimmed, replaced by something more measured. He glanced at Vanessa briefly before turning his attention to Whitaker. Mr. Whitaker, Prescott said, you may call your next witness. Whitaker stood quickly, straightening his tie. The plaintiff calls Dr. William Harding to the stand, he announced. A distinguished-looking man with a neatly trimmed beard and an air of practiced authority walked toward the witness stand, adjusting his tie before taking his seat. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. Dr. Harding had been hastily added to the plaintiff's witness list, clearly an attempt to counter her accusations of forgery. Whitaker wasted no time. Dr. Harding, he began, his voice steady, you have reviewed the documents in question, including the property deeds submitted by my client. Can you confirm the authenticity of my client's signature? Dr. Harding nodded confidently. Yes, he replied. Based on my analysis, the signature on the deed is consistent with other verified samples of the plaintiff's handwriting. Whitaker smiled triumphantly, turning toward Judge Prescott. Your Honor, he declared, this confirms that the defendant's claims of forgery are unfounded. Vanessa, who had been silently observing, rose from her chair. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm and clear, I would like to cross-examine the witness. Judge Prescott gestured for her to proceed, his expression guarded. Vanessa walked to the witness stand, her steps deliberate and confident. She carried a folder of documents in one hand, but in her other hand, a magnifying glass. "Mr. Harding," she began, her tone polite but firm, "you testified that the signature on the deed is consistent with the plaintiff's handwriting. Is that correct?" "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "And your analysis was based on visual examination of the documents?" "That's correct," Dr. Harding confirmed. Vanessa nodded slowly, setting her folder on the witness stand. "Did you use any specialized equipment, such as microscopic imaging or chemical analysis, to verify the age of the ink?" Dr. Harding hesitated for the first time. "No," he admitted. "My analysis did not include those methods." Vanessa's voice remained calm, but there was a faint edge to it now. "So your conclusion," she said, "is based solely on visual comparison?" "Yes," he said again, though this time his voice was noticeably less firm. Vanessa held up the magnifying glass. "Would you be willing to take a closer look at the signature on this document, specifically the ink pattern around the date?" Dr. Harding glanced at Whitaker, who gave a small, reluctant nod. Vanessa handed the document and the magnifying glass to Dr. Harding. The room fell silent as the expert witness leaned in, carefully examining the deed. A beat passed, then another. "Do you notice anything unusual about the ink around the date?" Dr. Harding straightened, his expression uneasy. "There appear to be slight discrepancies," he admitted. "The ink seems newer than the rest of the document." Vanessa stepped closer. "Would you agree," she asked, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "that these discrepancies suggest the date was altered after the document was originally signed?" Harding shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's possible," he said at last. Vanessa turned to Judge Prescott, her tone unwavering. "Your Honor, I request that this document be subjected to forensic ink analysis to determine the true age of the date." Judge Prescott's brow furrowed as he considered her request. Whitaker leapt to his feet, his voice tight with frustration. "Your Honor, this is yet another delay tactic. The defendant is undermining credible testimony with baseless speculation." Vanessa remained unflinching. "Your Honor," she countered, "the discrepancies in this document raise serious questions about its authenticity. If opposing counsel is confident in their case, they should have no objection to verifying the evidence." Judge Prescott tapped his gavel lightly, his face a mask of neutrality. "I will allow the request for forensic analysis," he announced. "However, I expect both parties to expedite this process." Whitaker sat down heavily, his frustration palpable. Vanessa returned to her seat, her calm demeanor unbroken. As the courtroom adjourned for lunch, whispers filled the room. Spectators speculated about the implications of the altered date. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Even the court stenographer seemed to sit a little straighter, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Back in his chambers, Judge Prescott sat at his desk, reviewing the morning's proceedings. He tapped his pen against the legal pad, his thoughts racing. He had underestimated Vanessa Carter. He could admit that now, even if only to himself. For the first time, he wasn't sure he was in control of this trial, and that unsettled him. But there was something else, too, something he hadn't expected. Respect, curiosity. Who exactly was Vanessa Carter? And what else was she about to reveal? Tomorrow, he suspected, he would find out. But deep down, he already knew. The truth was coming, and when it did, it would change everything. As the trial resumed after lunch, a palpable shift had settled over Fairview County Courthouse. Gone were the quiet whispers of skepticism. Now every murmur held anticipation. Vanessa Carter stepped back into courtroom 3B, her pace measured, her posture composed, and her mind sharp as ever. She could feel the change in the air. They weren't dismissing her anymore. As she passed, a few heads nodded in acknowledgement. Even the reporters, once distracted, now sat at full attention, their pens hovering above their notebooks, waiting for the next bombshell. At the plaintiff's table, Thomas Whitaker was visibly agitated. His usually perfectly groomed hair seemed slightly disheveled, and his assistant frantically flipped through stacks of papers. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Judge William Prescott, too, seemed to feel the shift. Seated behind his imposing bench, he adjusted his glasses before tapping his gavel. He scanned the room, his usual air of authority laced with a newfound tension, perhaps even curiosity. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice more measured than usual, The floor is yours. Vanessa stood slowly, her movements deliberate, her folder of documents clutched firmly in hand. She walked to the center of the courtroom, her heels clicking softly against the tiled floor. The gallery fell silent, all eyes fixed on her. This was the moment. Vanessa inhaled deeply and turned to face the judge. Your Honor, she began, her voice calm yet commanding, I would like to present additional evidence that further undermines the plaintiff's claims of ownership. Whitaker shot to his feet, his tone sharp. Objection, Your Honor, this is an ambush. Opposing counsel has not disclosed any new evidence in advance. Vanessa turned to face the judge, her expression unwavering. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, this evidence is in direct response to the questions raised during the plaintiff's presentation of their case. It's not an ambush, it's the truth. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Prescott raised a hand, silencing the room. Overruled, he said firmly. He turned to Vanessa. Let's hear it, Miss Carter. Vanessa nodded. She approached the evidence table, picking up a thick stack of documents and handed them to the bailiff. This morning, she said, we discussed discrepancies in the property deed, particularly the date, which appeared to have been altered. She let her words sink in before continuing. However, there's more. Judge Prescott narrowed his eyes. I conducted an independent title search through the Fairview County Recorder of Deeds. The room fell silent again. What I found was illuminating. The bailiff distributed copies of the report to the judge and opposing counsel. Whitaker snatched his copy, scanning it quickly. As his eyes darted across the page, his face darkened with each passing second. Vanessa turned back to the gallery, her voice unwavering. This is an official county record, she said. It shows that the property in question was never legally transferred to the plaintiff. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Vanessa's gaze remained steady. She turned to Judge Prescott. The last recorded deed lists the previous owner as Mr. Elijah Carter, my late father. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Judge Prescott banged his gavel. Order in the court, he barked. Turning back to Vanessa, his expression was sharp. Miss Carter, he said, leaning forward, are you claiming that the plaintiff fabricated their ownership entirely? Vanessa didn't flinch. Yes, Your Honor, she replied. Her voice was steady, and I intend to prove it. Whitaker rose abruptly, his face flushed with anger. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The defendant is attempting to rewrite the narrative with baseless allegations. Vanessa turned to him, her voice razor-sharp but calm. The records speak for themselves, Mr. Whitaker, she said. She tilted her head slightly. If you'd like, I can call a witness from the Recorder of Deeds office to authenticate them. Judge Prescott leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. After a moment, he motioned for Whitaker to sit down. Let's proceed with the evidence, he said. Vanessa walked back to the evidence table, retrieving another document. She held it up. Your Honor, she said, this is a letter from the plaintiff to a third party discussing plans to resell the property for a significant profit. Gasps rippled through the room. Vanessa handed the document to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Judge Prescott's brow furrowed deeply as he read. And this third party? He asked, looking up. Vanessa hesitated for just a moment before nodding. Yes, Your Honor. The third party is listed as Midwest Land Holdings, a company known for acquiring properties under dubious circumstances. Whitaker shot to his feet again. Objection. This is speculative and irrelevant. Judge Prescott glanced back down at the letter. He tapped his gavel lightly. Overruled. He looked up. The relevance is clear. Continue, Miss Carter. Vanessa turned back to the gallery. This letter not only demonstrates the plaintiff's intent to resell the property, she said, but it also suggests collusion with entities engaged in fraudulent activities. Combined with the altered deed and the lack of a legal transfer, it paints a very troubling picture. The plaintiff, Richard Langston, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His hand fidgeted nervously. At one point, he leaned over to whisper urgently to Whitaker. Whitaker brushed him off with a sharp gesture. Vanessa noticed their exchange, but she didn't comment. She simply turned back to Judge Prescott. She wasn't done yet. She still had one last piece of evidence. And tomorrow, she would deliver the final blow. The tension inside Fairview County Courthouse was unlike anything the courtroom had seen before. Courtroom 3B was packed wall-to-wall with reporters, attorneys, and members of the public eager to witness what had now become a sensational legal battle. What had started as a simple property dispute had unraveled into a stunning expose of fraud, and at the center of it all stood Vanessa Carter, calm, composed, and ready to deliver the final blow. At the plaintiff's table, Thomas Whitaker sat with his jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped his pen. Across from him, his client, Richard Langston, was visibly shaken. Gone was his arrogant demeanor. Now he looked like a man who knew he was running out of options. The sound of the gavel striking the bench echoed through the courtroom as Judge William Prescott called the session to order. His expression was neutral, but behind the facade, there was a sharp awareness in his gaze. Even he knew today's proceedings would decide everything. He looked at Vanessa. "Miss Carter, you may proceed." Vanessa rose from her seat, holding a single document in her hand. She walked to the center of the courtroom, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear. "Your Honor, over the past few days, I have presented evidence that challenges the plaintiff's claim to this property." She paused, letting her words settle over the room. "We have seen altered documents, financial inconsistencies, and questionable correspondence. Today I present the final piece of the puzzle." Vanessa turned to the bailiff, handing him the document. "This is my father's will," she announced, her voice unwavering. "Filed with the Fairview County Probate Court, it explicitly names me, Vanessa Carter, as the sole heir to the property in question." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff handed the document to Judge Prescott, who took a moment to examine it carefully. Meanwhile, the plaintiff's side was unraveling before everyone's eyes. Whitaker shot to his feet, his face flushed. "Your Honor, I object." His voice was louder than necessary, the panic clear. "This document was not disclosed prior to trial. It's inadmissible." Vanessa turned to face him, her expression calm but unyielding. "Your Honor," she said, "the plaintiff's failure to verify the chain of title made it unnecessary to introduce this document earlier. However, given the persistent challenges to my claim, it has become relevant." She met Judge Prescott's gaze without hesitation. "I ask that this document be admitted into evidence." Judge Prescott held up a hand, silencing Whitaker's protests. His tone was sharp. "Sit down, Mr. Whitaker." Whitaker hesitated, his teeth grinding together, but he finally dropped into his chair, his expression stormy. Vanessa turned back to the gallery. "This will establish an unbroken line of ownership, beginning with my father and ending with me." Her voice never wavered. "It negates the plaintiff's claim entirely." The room was dead silent. Judge Prescott looked at Whitaker. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, his voice low but firm, "do you have any evidence to refute this?" Whitaker hesitated, his lips pressed into a thin line. He turned to his client, Richard Langston, whose face was pale as a sheet. Langston shook his head slightly, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if holding on for dear life. Whitaker exhaled sharply. Then finally he turned back to the judge. "No, Your Honor." A murmur swept through the crowd. Judge Prescott's expression shifted subtly. For the first time, his carefully maintained neutrality seemed to waver. He looked at Vanessa, then back at Whitaker, before finally settling on Langston. His jaw tightened. Then he picked up his gavel. "This court finds in favor of the defendant." He struck the gavel against the bench. "The plaintiff's case is dismissed." For a moment, the words just hung there. And then, the room erupted in a frenzy of whispers, gasps, shock, excitement. At the plaintiff's table, Whitaker sank back into his seat, his face ashen. Langston looked defeated, his fingers twitching, as if grasping for an escape route that no longer existed. Meanwhile, Vanessa simply exhaled. She allowed herself one small moment, a single, satisfied breath. It was over. She had won. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed Vanessa, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in her direction. "Miss Carter, did you expect today's verdict? How does it feel to win against one of Fairview's top attorneys?" "What's next for you?" Vanessa answered calmly, carefully choosing her words. "The truth won today. That's all that matters." She didn't care about headlines or praise. She had fought for her father's legacy and won. As she walked away, leaving the noise of the press behind her, she finally allowed herself a real smile. The battle was over, and justice had prevailed. Angela Monroe sat still at the defense table, her hands resting lightly over her worn leather briefcase. She could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom, the spectators, the jury, the judge, and most importantly, the man she was about to destroy with the truth. Across the room, Howard Tremont clenched his jaw, his normally smooth confidence replaced by something else, uncertainty. His client, Richard Langston, looked even worse. He shifted in his seat, fingers drumming anxiously against the polished wood of the plaintiff's table. His once arrogant posture had collapsed, shoulders hunched forward, his gaze darting between the judge and his attorney. Angela could see the walls closing in on them, and she was about to shove them the rest of the way in. Judge Edward Sinclair leaned forward, his piercing gaze sweeping the courtroom before settling on Tremont. Mr. Tremont, do you have any further evidence to support your client's claim? Tremont's lips parted, but no words came out. His hesitation stretched for a beat too long, enough for the murmurs to start rippling through the gallery. Finally, he exhaled sharply. No, Your Honor. It was over. For the first time since the trial began, Judge Sinclair's usually rigid expression softened, if only slightly. He turned to Angela, studying her, perhaps reevaluating everything he had assumed about her since she first walked into his courtroom. The gavel hovered in his grasp. A decision lingered in the air, heavy, inevitable. Angela did not flinch. She kept her spine straight, her head high, and then, bang. This court finds in favor of the defendant. The words echoed through the courtroom, followed by a collective gasp. Angela released the breath she had been holding. She had won. The moment court adjourned, the energy in the room exploded. Spectators erupted into murmurs and whispers, reporters scrambling to take notes, eager to be the first to break the story. Angela barely had time to gather her documents before the crowd closed in on her. Ms. Monroe, how do you feel about your victory? Do you plan to press charges against the plaintiff for fraud? What's next for you? Angela ignored the questions. This wasn't about publicity. This wasn't about fame. This was about justice. Tremont and Langston, now disgraced, hurried out of the courtroom. Langston refused to look at anyone, while Tremont kept his expression carefully neutral. But Angela could see it in his eyes. This loss would follow him. By the time she stepped outside the courthouse, the whispers had turned into headlines. Her name was everywhere, but she didn't stop to read them. She had no interest in what people thought of her now. Her focus was already on what came next, and she had work to do. Angela Monroe walked away, leaving Judge Edward Sinclair standing in the golden sunlight streaming through the courthouse's tall windows. He watched her go, his normally sharp, unreadable expression softened by thoughtfulness. The rigid authority he had wielded in his courtroom had for once been challenged, and not just by anyone, but by a woman he had grossly underestimated. She had not just won a case, she had shattered expectations. As Angela stepped into the cool afternoon air, she took a long breath, feeling the weight of months of tension slowly lift from her shoulders. But this wasn't just relief. This was victory. Later that evening, Angela drove toward the place that had started it all, the house at the heart of the trial. The modest brick home sat at the end of a quiet street lined with old oak trees, their bare branches swaying gently in the winter breeze. It had been years since she last stepped foot on that porch, but the moment she pulled into the driveway, it was as if she had never left. A wave of memories rushed back, wrapping around her like an old, familiar embrace. Her father's laugh echoing through the yard, the scent of fresh-cut grass on summer mornings, warm evenings spent on the porch, his deep voice telling stories about resilience, about standing tall even when the world tries to push you down. Angela cut the car engine and sat there for a long moment, staring at the house that had once been her sanctuary. The soft glow of a street lamp cast long shadows against the bricks, highlighting every weathered mark, every scar, as if the house itself had endured its own battle, just like she had. She exhaled slowly. This was more than a house. It was her father's legacy. Angela stepped out of the car, the crisp night air biting at her cheeks as she approached the front door. Her fingers brushed against the faded wood, her touch light but reverent. For a brief moment she hesitated, feeling the full weight of what this home represented. Then she unlocked the door. The hinges creaked softly as she stepped inside. The air inside the house carried a faint, familiar scent. Her father's old aftershave, the worn leather of his favorite chair, and the aged wood that had absorbed a lifetime of laughter, arguments, and quiet moments of reflection. Everything was just as she remembered. A faded armchair still sat in the corner of the living room, next to a stack of old books, their spines cracked from years of use. The walls bore faint outlines where family photos had once hung, and in the kitchen, the same wooden table, the one where she had spent countless nights studying cases and debating with her father about the law, stood untouched, waiting for her. Angela set her briefcase down on the kitchen table and ran her fingers over its worn surface. This was home. As she explored the house, her eyes landed on a small keychain tucked inside a drawer. She picked it up carefully. A silver charm dangled from the ring, engraved with the initials E.M., her father's name. She curled her fingers around it, holding it tightly, as if the small piece of metal could somehow bring him back to her. And then she noticed something else. Tucked away in the drawer of her father's study was a sealed envelope. Her name was written on the front, the handwriting unmistakable. Her father's. With trembling hands, she opened it. The letter inside was simple but heavy with meaning. Dear Angela, if you're reading this, it means the house is yours now. I hope it never came to a fight. But if it did, I know you stood your ground. You always were the strong one. This place isn't just a house. It's a piece of us. Every nail, every board, every brick holds a memory. Protect it. Not just because it's yours, but because it reminds us where we came from and how far we can go. And Angela, never forget, you are capable of more than anyone can imagine, even yourself. Keep fighting for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I'm so proud of you, always, Dad. Angela's vision blurred, tears slipping down her cheeks as she clutched the letter to her chest. This fight wasn't just about property. It had been about proving she belonged, about proving her father's legacy was worth protecting. And she had done it. In the days that followed, Angela set to work. She made plans to restore the house, determined to honor her father by preserving what he had built. But she also saw an opportunity, something bigger than herself. She reached out to local organizations proposing an idea. Turn the house into a place where people could learn their rights, a legal workshop, a community resource center, a safe space for those who had been dismissed, just like she had been. It's not just my home, Angela explained to a colleague over coffee one afternoon. It's a place where people can come to feel safe, to learn, to fight back, to know they are not alone. Her colleague smiled. You've turned a legal battle into something bigger. Angela nodded, her resolve unshaken. She wasn't just rebuilding a house. She was building a legacy. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Angela stood on the porch, watching the golden light fade into dusk. She held her father's keychain in her palm, running her thumb over the engraved initials. This house had been the setting of her greatest battle, but it had also become a symbol of her tenacity, of justice, of the undeniable power of truth. She had proven herself, not just in the courtroom, but to the entire world. She had fought, and she had won. Above her, the first stars began to appear in the night sky. Angela lifted her head and whispered softly, "We did it, Dad." The wind rustled the oak trees, carrying her words into the night. And as she stood there, her heart full, her purpose clear, she knew this was just the beginning. With the judge's gavel delivering the final verdict, Angela Monroe had done more than reclaim her family's home. She had taught everyone in that courtroom a lesson they would never forget. The underrated woman, the hidden genius, the relentless fighter. She had turned the tables and proved that when justice is fought for with determination, it can conquer all odds. And this was only the start. Angela Monroe's story is more than just a courtroom victory. It is a testament to resilience, justice, and the power of standing up for what is right, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. Through her journey, we learn valuable lessons about perseverance, self-belief, and the importance of challenging biases. Lessons that extend beyond the courtroom and into our everyday lives. One of the most powerful takeaways from Angela's story is the importance of fighting for what rightfully belongs to you, even when the odds seem stacked against you. Many people would have given up when faced with a corrupt system, an unfair judge, and a seasoned attorney determined to discredit them. Angela, however, refused to back down. She understood that justice isn't handed to you. It must be fought for. Her story teaches us that when faced with injustice, We must equip ourselves with knowledge, strategy, and an unwavering belief in the truth. If Angela had let fear dictate her actions, she would have lost not only her home, but also the chance to prove that she, and countless others like her, deserve to be heard and respected. Another critical lesson in this story is the power of intelligence and preparation. Angela was underestimated from the moment she walked into the courtroom. The judge dismissed her, the opposing lawyer mocked her, and even the audience saw her as nothing more than an untrained, naive defendant. But what they failed to realize was that Angela had prepared for this moment her entire life. She was meticulous in her research, strategic in her arguments, and unwavering in her confidence. The way she presented her case, step by step, breaking down every false claim and exposing every flaw in the opposition's argument, proves that knowledge is power. This lesson applies not just in legal battles, but in every challenge we face in life. Whether in a workplace, a business deal, or a personal struggle, those who are well prepared and informed hold the real power, even when others initially underestimate them. Angela's story also highlights the dangers of bias and the importance of seeing beyond first impressions. Judge Sinclair represents the many people in positions of power who judge others based on appearance rather than ability. When he first saw Angela, a modestly dressed black woman representing herself, he immediately assumed she was incompetent. But as the case unfolded, he was forced to confront his own biases. Angela's story is a reminder that preconceived notions can blind us to the truth. Whether in the workplace, in social interactions, or in institutions like the justice system, we must be mindful of our own biases and strive to judge people based on their abilities, not our assumptions. Beyond personal victory, Angela's story teaches us the importance of legacy and fighting for something bigger than ourselves. The house she fought for was not just a piece of property, it was a symbol of her father's hard work, their family's history, and the values he instilled in her. Too often, people are willing to let go of things that hold sentimental or historical value because the fight seems too difficult. But Angela's unwavering commitment to honoring her father's legacy reminds us that some battles are worth fighting, not just for ourselves, but for those who came before us and those who will come after us. By turning her legal victory into an opportunity to help others, she transformed a personal struggle into a greater mission, one that would impact many lives beyond her own. Her story is also a lesson in humility and growth, particularly seen in Judge Sinclair. While he started the trial as a man filled with arrogance and bias, by the end, he acknowledged his mistake. This highlights that even those in power can and should learn from their misjudgments. In a world where many refuse to admit when they are wrong, his ability to recognize Angela's brilliance and offer her respect is a crucial lesson. Growth is possible for everyone, but it requires reflection and the willingness to change. Lastly, Angela Monroe's journey teaches us that true power is not about who has the most influence or authority. It is about who is willing to fight for the truth with courage and integrity. Many people in that courtroom held power. Judge Sinclair had the authority, Howard Tremont had the experience, and Richard Langston had wealth and connections. But in the end, none of those things could overpower Angela's intelligence, preparation, and determination to seek justice. It was her persistence, not her status, that won the case. This is a vital reminder that those who stay true to their principles, remain steadfast in their convictions, and refuse to back down in the face of adversity will always have the upper hand in the long run. Angela Monroe walked into the courtroom as someone who was dismissed, underestimated, and overlooked. But by the time the case was over, she had left as someone who commanded respect, admiration, and the undeniable truth. Her story is a powerful example of how one person, armed with knowledge and determination, can change the course of their own destiny, and in doing so, teach the world a lesson they will never forget. If you enjoyed this story and found its lessons inspiring, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends and family, and leave a comment down below about your thoughts on Angela's journey. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on more powerful and thought-provoking stories like this one. Your support helps us continue bringing you stories that inspire, empower, and remind us of the strength we all carry within. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.